the economic shock we're living nowadays doesn't compare to '07, '08. In fact, it doesn't compare to anything that we have witnessed in the past 100 years. Imagine yourself, the typical shock or recession happens, you're driving 55 miles an hour, and then you have to slow down to 45. That would be equivalent to the typical recession. Once the obstacle is overcome, you return to driving 55. This, what we're witnessing right now, is the equivalent of driving off into the ditch and coming to a sudden stop. That's how different it is. And we don't know when we're going to come out of that ditch and in what shape. So this is a very different experience. All governments are trying to do something. Some are cutting or postponing taxes. Some are increasing spending to support the unemployed and the needy. Others are bailing out companies, whether airlines or hotels or hospitals or what it be. And so there's a variety of responses. A lot depends not on what is ideal, because since we've never had an economic shock of this magnitude, we'll only know what worked best when it's all over. But one key difference is you have a number of countries that are wealthy and creditworthy. And so they can incur a lot of debt in salvaging the economy, and nothing's going to happen in their bond or currency or stock markets as a result of them doing that. And then you have a large number of middle income, low middle income, and particularly poor countries that don't have the fiscal space or the monetary credibility to engage in the kind of rescues that the wealthier, more creditworthy countries can. They cannot just spend their way out of the problem, because that would mean either leaning on their monetary authority to print money, literally, to fund the expenses, or else to sell bonds. But sell bonds to whom? Usually you don't have the pension funds, you don't have the insurance companies, you don't have the institutional investor base that you do in wealthier countries. So just like in the US economy, this sudden stop in economic activity is hitting the lower middle class and the poor the hardest. Likewise, around the world, it's the lower middle income and the poorest countries that are now getting infected in Latin America, in Africa, in the Middle East, and South Asia that are going to suffer the most. It's important that just as the scientists are keeping track of various experiments in different countries with shutting down, opening up, testing for this, testing for that, vaccine production, etc., we in the field of economics have our own job cut out for ourselves. We need to monitor what various governments are doing, how they're doing it, and in order to learn from this pandemic, in case there are future coronaviruses, mark 2021 or 2022. This sudden stop in economic activity is going to have long-lasting consequences. First of all, we don't know how long a time and severity of a problem we will be having. In your typical recession, it's a V-shaped event. As I mentioned before, you were driving 55, you slow down to 45, then you go back up to 55. But in this case, we're not going to have a typical V-shaped recovery. At best, we're going to have a U-shaped recovery, namely after a number of months of gradually returning to more normal economic conditions, we will finally have a recovery and maybe go back to where we were before. Never mind the possibility that we have a W, where we loosen up and then we see that there is more contagion, so we have to tighten up. And then we loosen up and we find out that there's still more contagion, and so we have to tighten up again and so on. But yes, experience shows even in the normal a cookie cutter recession, there are long-lasting effects, especially for students who graduate from college precisely in the middle of the recession. There are studies that show, for example, that a number of the students who graduated in May 2009 were disadvantaged for the decade that followed. I have questions from students right now about how to get a job under these circumstances. So yes, unfortunately, whether students trying to get a job or as people working in entertainment or restaurants or leisure activities, we're going to have permanent effects.